we can go ahead and get started this morning. We are in the book of Isaiah, book that we're going through the Gospel Advocate, the Foundations Bible Study, part 1 of Isaiah. If you're looking for a Clay Brown's class, you are in the right place. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Daniel, and as I like to say, I'm a younger and less attractive version of Clay Brown. But he and his family are out this week at a wedding in Nashville, Tennessee. We wish them the best. We wish them Godspeed as they come back. So we will be going through this second part. Just as a note for class, I've got a little bit of technology I'm recording up here, but it's not connected to Zoom, and I'm doing 2 PowerPoints at the same time, so if I'm a little bit slow in transition, bear with me. I got 2 clickers, got 1 for each hand, so I'll be going through that. If you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand nice and high so I can see you. I tend to get just really in the zone, and I don't necessarily notice people that want to make a comment, but please feel free to do so. Just raise your hand, shout out if I don't see you. And then again, does anybody need a book before we get going? You raise your hand nice and high. If you need a book, I can get you one. If you don't have one, or if you don't want to get one right now, there are some in the lobby, or you can see me after class as we go through in today's lesson. So again, we are going through Isaiah part 1. Last week we talked about 8th century Judah. We talked about what was going on at the time that the people went away from God. What caused them to go to split into 2 kingdoms, and then for Israel itself to go into oblivion. They were taken out and just demolished by the nations around them. And then we looked specifically at 8th century Judah. If you remember, both kingdoms were united during the times of Saul, David, and Solomon. And then 2 kings came, Jeroboam and Rehoboam. And Jeroboam was the king of Israel, and Rehoboam, if I remember correctly, was the king of Judah. And from that point on, the 2 kingdoms were separated. We're told that there were kings in Judah that were good. Kings in Judah that would bring the people back to God. And we're told that the kings of Israel just kept getting worse and worse and worse. And it's a terrible tragedy as you would read through the history in the book of Kings, the 1st Kings, the 2nd Kings, the history of the kings of Israel. And it would say this king came about and he was worse than anybody before. And then this next guy came and he was worse than anybody before him. And it never got better. But there was hope in Judah. And that's what we talked about, the prophecy, the century of Judah, what happened. And now we're going to look a little bit. The book lays out prophecy and change in Judah. As I was talking to Clay about the lesson this week, I was kind of forlorn about the topic because what we would cover this week in the book is everything he covered in the last quarter. He did a magnificent job covering the times of David, the exploits of David, and I didn't want to rehash a lot of that. So he said, feel free to do kind of whatever you want to do, and I took that liberty myself. So we're not going to look at that kind of thing. We're going to look at departing from the book somewhat today. Again, Clay covered these things in great detail from the last class, so we're not going to cover that again. We're going to take a look at one of my favorite topics of the book of Isaiah. One theme of Isaiah is that God's prophet calls his people to spiritual excellence. And what we mean by that, we don't mean wealth. We don't mean prosperity. We don't mean physical success. We mean you being the best you that you can be for God. Isaiah calls the people of Judah to spiritual excellence. And I think a lot of times we don't necessarily focus on that in our lives anymore. And this is something that I've been thinking about a lot in my life. We look at Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. Go back one more. There we go. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 31. Isaiah says, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Isaiah says, if you have the courage to walk with God, if you have the courage to be one of his number, if you have the courage to be called the way he wants you to be called, you will do things you never thought you would do before. He will lift you on wings like eagles. Eagles aren't birds that would do necessarily much more than soar when they would get high in the winds and high when they would be soaring about. Eagles like to be up high. And he says, what I'm going to do, all you have to do is put your wings out and I will buffet you up. I will give you the energy and lift and take you up so that you can rest your weary wings and soar with me on these high currents. I will take you up to high places. Chapter 3, verse 19, it says, the Lord is my strength. He will make my feet like the deer's on my high hills. There's a deer called the okapi. It's a very interesting deer, and it can scale heights that are literally like a vertical incline. And it has no issues walking on those waves. Habakkuk says that God is like that. God gives us the energy to walk in places that others would fail. Other people would look at that, other animals might look at that cliff and say, there's no way. There is no way on earth anyone could scale that height and get up to where those deer are. And the okapi said, it's not my problem. I've been trained to do that. That's what I'm meant to do. Habakkuk says, no matter what happens, in this passage, it's a very beautiful prayer that Habakkuk has. He's contemplating that everything has gone wrong in the world. The stalls are vacant. There's no sound of animals that farmers or that shepherds have in their stalls. The vines are vacant. There's no food to be found. That there's a time of desolation and the righteous and the unrighteous together are suffering. But Habakkuk says, I'm not going to worry about that because I'm going to go to God and He's going to show me in times of spiritual famine. In times where everything seems to be going bad about me, He's going to give me the sure footing that I need in this life. And He's going to take me to heights unknown to many. And that's what we're talking about today. What would it be like in our lives to soar like an eagle soared? What would it be like in our lives, like those okapi on that hill, to be able to have that sure footing and not to worry about the things around us, but to strive for spiritual excellence in our lives? And that's what I'm so excited to talk about this morning as we look at the book of Isaiah and as we prime ourselves to find out what challenges Isaiah put before us. The one big thing he wants us to do is reach these heights. Reach the heights of spiritual excellence. These places are hard to reach. They're not places that are easily found. And so what we're going to talk about as we obtain spiritual excellence is going to take some work on our part. It's going to take some sacrifice and some diligence in our part to be a disciple and to do what disciples do. Sometimes I think we lose what the word disciple means. You think about old kung fu movies. I like old kung fu movies. Asian cinema. It's really fun to watch some of those. The fight scenes that they would choreograph. They don't make those movies like that anymore. But you might see some time where they would have some sort of monastery on a hill. And the old teacher would be sitting there watching everybody else practicing and doing their fighting and doing their sparring. You notice that everyone looks the same. Everyone's wearing the same thing. Everyone's hair is cut the same way. Because they're disciples. They've said, I've come to you, teacher, to show me what you want me to do. And whatever you tell me to do, I'm going to do that. So if you want me to wear this certain robe, or if you want me to cut my hair in a certain way, and those things mean those things to you, that's what I'm going to do. That's the same thing for us as we look at spiritual excellence. When we think about the heights of the eagles and the footpath that the deer have to walk, they're places that are hard to reach. And they're hard to reach because a lot of people don't want to put the work in to get there. So just remember that. It's hard to reach, and we're going to have to buckle down, and we're going to have to look at some very important things. And there are also places which can be scary. Again, those hills that those okapi have, that they climb up, they're really quite daunting. There's a video that you might go find on the internet if you want to Google it if you're interested in it, where there's a hydroelectric dam, which is a very huge dam, almost on the scale like Hoover Dam would be. And there's goats that'll just climb up the front face of that dam and just eat the grass grown on the dam. And people look down and think, how in the world can you do that? The goats don't care. There's food. They want to get there. If we want to reach the spiritual heights and the spiritual excellence that God wants to give us, we can't be afraid. We can't be scared that we might succeed in life. And that's one of the things I think that stops our drive for spiritual excellence is we don't know if we can succeed, and then we don't know what to do if we get there. It's hard to be excellent because once you're excellent, people expect it out of you again and again and again. What if we fail? So that can be scary. They're hard to reach. They can be scary. And they're not overrun with population. There's not a traffic jam of eagles when they soar through the mountains. There's not 50,000 eagles that are flying over there. People getting in their way. The hills and the mountain paths that the okapi are walking on, they're not overrun with predators. They're not overrun with other opaque necessarily. They're hard to reach. They're not overrun. It can be lonely to be excellent. Excellence can be isolated. You think about, we talk about the 1%ers in this world, the billionaires, right? There's not many billionaires in this world because it's hard to reach that level. It could be isolated. But we have a God who is a great God and a God who treads all places. And even if we reach a path of spiritual excellence and we might find ourselves alone there, we know that God is with us and we don't need to be afraid. And we don't need to feel lonely because He is there with us. So this morning I want to look at some things that we can do to help reach spiritual excellence. One thing I want to note is that as a people, I think we've conquered suffering. And I don't mean that lightly. I don't want you to think I made you a light of that or a joke of that. Suffering is hard. Pain is hard in our lives. Yet I think we have done an amazing job of learning how to be a stalwart works of faith of those times. We've learned how to plant our feet and bear up under the pressure of this world. There are so many things and so many changes, even in my lifetime, that I've seen in our society, that we've rallied against and we've fought against, and we've become more and more strong and more sure of ourselves to stand up and say, that's not right. We shouldn't be like that. The society that we live in today is nothing like the society, say, in the 40s and 50s or 60s, where people were taught the Bible in schools, where men and women were committed to marriage, and people were committed to living a godly lifestyle, even if they really didn't believe in it because of the social pressures of the day. We're far from it. Yet we have conquered, I think, suffering in our lives. We are, again, so good at bearing up against that pressure. We've had, in the past few years even, terrible losses in our congregation, yet we've rallied around those who have lost. We have shown the love of God and of Jesus to them. We have done the right things that we should have done. And we've helped them and we've helped ourselves in our faith. And I believe as a people we have done such a great job of that. Because again, that's more common. That's more common that we all would suffer. I think we struggle through excellence. I don't know that we come to a point where we have spiritual excellence and we rise up in our lives and we're comfortable with that. Not to say that we would be prideful in those moments, not to say that we would in any way lose ourselves, but we don't know how to deal with that. Because excellence doesn't always come like it does with suffering. And I want us today to look at the book of Isaiah and to prepare ourselves to have those times. What happens when we find ourselves in spiritual excellence? There are some instructions given in the New Testament about how Thessalonians, if you've come to God, if you've come out of the world and you have lived a sinful lifestyle and you've found peace in your life, if you've found love in your life and you're creating a family unit that is totally different than other people, what should you do? Well, you should live a quiet life, mind your own business, and work with your hands, because that will win our souls. The Bible provides us instructions and ways to show us that when we come to Christ, we make that most important decision in our life when we change. And we become, as Clay would say, counterculture to everything. Now what do we do? Now that we find ourselves in this situation, what do we do? We struggle with that. And I hope today we can kind of unpack that a little bit and work on what we do to strive for that spiritual excellence. We talked about how the kingdom of Israel failed God. It was a terrible, terrible thing that happened. The people of God fell so far from what they should have done. If you remember what Clay was talking about and the history we looked at, imagine yourself that you're just Joe Israelite walking around in the 8th century of Israel or of Judah. What you would find would be horrific. You would walk by a tree and there would be a statue to an idol underneath that tree. You would go and any kind of sacrificial ornamentation that might have been raised to God would be leveled to the ground. You would see statues all along the landscape to Baal and Asherah. And every so often you would hear screams of children as adults and parents would sacrifice their own children to the Baals. Horrific things that were happening. The kingdom of Israel completely failed God in what they did. God had invited them to walk with Him, and they chose their own path. We look at three things as we process what happened. And it's a little bit of a revisit from what Clay talked talked about last week, but it was a scripture that really captured my attention, and I wanted to spend a little bit more detail on it. We'll see three things that happened: the call to the people, the compromise that they made, and then the consequence of what happened. We see the call in Leviticus 26, verse 12. God says, "I will walk among you and be your God, and you will be my people." There was a very special call that went out to these people. That among all the nations, I would put my presence among you. And that I would be your God. And that you will be mine. We see a few things here that God reveals himself to a people, a very specific people. There we know there was two times in history that everyone in the world knew about God. Adam and Eve, and after the flood. Everyone had an intimate relationship, as far as we know, with God. And then entered deception. And people fall away. But through that bloodline of Adam and through the bloodline of Noah, God called out a very specific people and said, "I want to be among you. And I want you to know that I'm here. And I'm going to be your God, and you're going to be mine. I'm going to possess you, and we're going to walk together. I've called you to me." God today has called us to him. Through the blood of the Son, through the resurrection, the sacrifice that Jesus made to us, God has called us out. And said, not only do I just want this specific bloodline of people, but the entire world to come to me. God today has called us. Are we answering that call? Because if we don't answer the call, we're going to fall into the same trap that Israel fell into. And the same problems that they had. The compromise we find in 2 Kings 17, verse 7 following. A verse that Clay read last week. "For so it was that the children of Israel had sinned against the Lord their God, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt, from under the hand of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. And they had feared other gods, and they had walked in the statutes of the nations, whom the Lord had cast out from before the children of Israel, and of the kings of Israel, which they had made." God said, "You are going to be my special people. I'm going to be your God. No one else is yours, solely. And I'm going to walk with you. I'm going to carry you through burdens, and no matter where you go, I will be with you." And unfortunately, then we're told later on, many generations later in 2 Kings, that they didn't decide to walk with God. They had decided, even after he walked them out of Egypt, he walked with them out of Egypt. He walked with them through the wilderness. Everywhere they were, he was. But they decided to fear other gods. And they walked in the statutes of the nations, whom the Lord had cast out. You notice Lord is in all caps. You might be aware that's the proper name of God. God had revealed himself not only as their God, but as a personal God. I'm going to tell you my name. Jehovah. Yahweh. The children of Israel decided, I don't want to walk with you. I want to walk with the other people around me. And follow the statutes of them around me. Follow their laws. Do what they did. And who the Lord had cast out. God told them to go dispossess the people. Take that land. They said, we don't want to be doing that. We just want to be like them. Finally, the consequence then of what happened. 2 Kings 17, starting in verse 22. But the children of Israel walked in all the sins of Jeroboam, which he did. They did not depart from them until the Lord removed Israel out of his sight. As he has said by all his servants the prophets, so Israel was carried away from their own land to Assyria, as it is to this day. God says, I'm going to walk with you. I want you to walk with me. Israel said, we don't want to. We want to be like everybody else. And so they walked right into the wilderness. Walking. They chose their own path. It's so disheartening that those were the decisions that they made. The thing we have to remember is we're just like them. People are people. Decisions are decisions. We're no different now than they were then. They did not choose to walk with God. They were influenced by those around them, and then they walked into oblivion. And that's a danger, that's a pitfall for us that we need to understand. If we're going to reach spiritual excellence, we have to answer God's call. We have to continually walk with him, and that by therefore, avoiding a walk into oblivion, but instead walking through into righteousness and into the promised land that he provides to us one day. The failure of Israel, they did not walk with God, they walked their own path, And they walked right into it. So my question is, what was the first step that set them on this path? When we went to 8th century Judah, this lesson, we're kind of backing up now, kind of more into like Samuel and David. So what was the first step? What caused it? What was the root cause of all of this that got them on that wrong path? It was the desire for sameness. The children of Israel weren't happy by being special. They wanted to be special, but they wanted to be like everyone else. And this is something I think that we struggle with. God has called us to uniqueness. God has called us to be set apart. But again, that's lonely. Maybe none of our friends do that. Maybe we come from a family that doesn't appreciate that. My father was raised in the Lutheran church. And when he was converted when I was 2 years old, his family nearly disowned him. His parents hated my mother from the day that she got married to my father. I never had a great relationship with my grandparents. Toward the end of their life, they really created a relationship. By that time, it was too late. We were teenagers and we kind of moved on. We didn't see them a lot. But they've lost out. Because my dad had become unique. My dad had become different. And they struggled with that. They didn't like that. They thought he was wrong. I don't want to get it all back and forth there, but there was a division that came. It caused a rift. It's hard to deal with those things sometimes. It's easier to kind of get along and go along, right? But they wanted same. The people had settled into Canaan, and judges ruled over them for 400 years back in the day. So what happened was the people had settled the land, and for generations, everybody kind of did what they thought was right. The priests of Levi were around to offer sacrifices, but there was really no necessarily restrictions on what the men would do with the family, and there was no patriarch or overall laws other than the law of Moses, and people would just do what they thought was right. And every so often, a judge would pop up and would correct something that was very regional. The judges weren't necessarily a judge for all of Israel, but they were very regional. And if you know the story of the judges, many of them were fairly flawed. Samson, fairly flawed. They weren't always the greatest men and women that would come up, but they did their best. And they would work and they would rule over regions of the land for about 400 years. And finally, a prophet and priest was selected to lead in the land. He was a spiritual leader, and we're talking about the man Samuel. He was a spiritual leader. He was one that would come and would unite the entire nation to follow God and to go back to God and to mend the error of their ways. He was a military leader. Samuel would stand and give military strategy. He would go before God and he would try to make military decisions. Sometimes the decisions would be not to fight. Sometimes he would say, we shouldn't fight today. We should offer a sacrifice to God. And we should apologize and repent to God for what we've been doing. And maybe he will remove this army from around us. And so he made military decisions. And he also worked in a circuit of preaching, teaching, judging, and prophesying. If you look, I believe his home was in Ramah, which is, I believe, in the northern part of Israel. And Samuel would have a circuit every year that he would travel, up and down, around, and he would prophesy and preach. And it would be similar to sometimes maybe back in the day where you would have tent meetings, and some of the preachers would go around and do a circuit. They really wouldn't have a home congregation, but they would just go around and preach and teach and help people. And that's what Samuel did. But he would always go back to Ramah because that would be his home, and that's typically where he would end the year. He was a very busy man. He was a very important man, and he was instrumental in gathering the people and leading them for many, many years. And Samuel served the people his whole life. If you remember, his mother lent him to God. She brought him when he was an infant to Eli, and Eli raised him, and he served God literally his entire life. Ever since he was little, he served God. And when he got very old, the people wanted a king because they wanted to be like everyone else. 1 Samuel chapter 8, starting in verse 19. Nevertheless, the people refused to obey the voice of Samuel. And they said, "No, but we will have a king over us, that we may also be like all the nations, and that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." Samuel was devastated by this decision. The people didn't want a king. They wanted a king because they wanted to be like everyone else. And that was just something that Samuel hated because he knew that God was there. And they were rejecting him. But why did they do that? The people desired sameness. That's maybe the choice that got them on this path. But what was the final straw that cemented that into place? Why did they choose that? Samuel didn't understand. He was so devastated, but he couldn't answer the question because he was too close to the situation. A little visual here to kind of demonstrate the problem that Samuel had. This is something that I saw on Facebook. I'm not typically one for videos on Facebook. I don't know. I find them irritating. But this one actually caught my attention. I thought it was pretty good. Your nose is located right here. Obviously, well, all of us that have noses today. And your mouth is right here. If you have bad breath, you won't know. Everybody else will know. We severely lack self-awareness. Samuel was lacking self-awareness. Why the people were rebelling was completely obvious to literally everyone in the nation of Israel, but Samuel didn't understand. The root of the cause was bad leadership. The reason that people wanted to be like everyone else is because their leaders, for at least 2 generations, had been terrible. Absolutely terrible. And they, in my mind, when I'm reading them, they said, if we're going to have terrible leaders, we might as well be like everybody else and have like the terrible leaders they have. We don't need to be unique in our terrible leadership. The sons of Eli and the sons of Samuel caused a lot of problems. Again, Samuel was the prophet that came before God, directly preceding all the kings of the United Kingdom, Saul, David, and Solomon. Eli was the priest that was helping raise Samuel and was the main priest in that area before Samuel was around. He had 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they caused the people to hate the offering of the Lord. It was one of their problems. There was a tradition that would happen when a man would be offering a sacrifice to God, and the priest would come by, he would take a hook and throw it to the pot or something that the man was offering, and take out the best choice meats for himself. That was what Hophni and Phinehas were doing. They were taking the best choice cuts of meat from around from what the people were sacrificing. And if anybody threw a fit about that, Hophni and Phinehas said, well, guess what? If you don't let me have what I want, I'm not going to accept your sacrifice. And it said because of what they did, the people abhorred the sacrifice of the Lord. That is to me one of the scariest verses in all of the Bible. The idea that I personally can do something to make someone hate coming and worshiping God scares me to death. But that's what Hophni and Phinehas were doing. That wasn't all that they were doing. They were sexually impure. It said they were meeting the women that were coming to worship and then sleeping with them. They were causing the people to abhor the offering, and then they were sexually impure in their own lives, turning the women into just uses for themselves, selfish uses for themselves. And then they were unrestrained. 2 verses that are interesting to me in the book of Samuel, it said that God went to Eli and says, you tell your sons to restrain themselves, because I'm not happy with what's going on. Eli failed. He tried to talk to his boys, and they didn't listen, they ignored him. And then when Samuel was talking to God, and God revealed the plan for Samuel to take over Eli, he said, one of the reasons that I'm punishing Eli and removing this relationship with him is because he failed to restrain his sons. I find that very interesting. Because I wonder as a father, right now, I can restrain my children. It's pretty interesting. Even if I need to just, I can do that. I can literally restrain them, right? Hold them like this. But as they grow older, when does that end? When does that idea of restraint end? Well, maybe never. God was putting this squarely on the shoulders of Samuel as well, or Eli. Hophni and Phinehas are guilty, but Eli is also culpable for lack of restraint of his sons. Now, the thing is, once I can no longer do this to my children, right? Once I can no longer do this, I have to turn into an influencer. If I can't tell them, they're not going to listen to me necessarily what to do. My mom would say, as children get older and as their ears get closer to your mouth, they stop listening. They just lose the ability. And once they pass your ears, they no longer have the ability to hear you. have to become influencers. We have to become people that maybe, apply to their greed a little bit. Hey, well, help me out here, and I'll give you a little bit of this, or, if you do what's right, your life will go so much better. They were unrestrained. These were the men that were the priests of God. It didn't get much better with the sons of Samuel. Oh, I'm sorry. They were also vile. If we didn't cover that, they were vile. God called them vile. Samuel had at least 2 sons, Joel and Abijah. It said they did not walk in Samuel's ways. They sought after dishonest gain. They liked bribes. They liked to be bribed. And they perverted justice. Again, these are the men, for at least 2 generations, that served as the priests of God. No wonder the people wanted a king. No wonder the people were tired of suffering through their worship. No wonder they decided to choose a bad path. Their leadership drove them to it. Spiritual leaders may fail to set a positive generational legacy. And it can be especially true for those in the service of God. I ask myself, what happened? You have Eli, who's obviously capable of raising a boy in the service of God because he did it for Samuel. What happened in these men's families that caused such an issue for their boys to stray so far? Yes, there are decisions that young men and women make, that there are very faithful men and women in our brotherhood that are shining examples, that raise families and maybe have 5 children and one of them make bad choices and stray from the Lord. I don't know that that's what we're talking about. We're talking about men here who chose very vile lives. Again, it's terrible when a child, would go away, but what were these men doing? Why did they lose track of their family so much? Could it be they were too busy serving God? And before you say, well, how could you be too busy serving God? I heard it said one time, if you're too busy reading the Bible and your child comes to you with a need and you say, I'm sorry, go away, I'm reading the Bible right now. You made the wrong choice. We need to make sure as we're striving for spiritual excellence and we're looking at our lives and how to grow and how to do the right things for God, that we're bringing our family along with us and not doing this in spite of them. That it's so important that we don't repeat the mistakes that Eli and Samuel made, and it's so important that we make sure that we look at setting a generational legacy in a positive way. That we show them what to do and how to serve God. And we have to be very sensitive to the fact that the people who serve us are in danger of failing their families if they get too much time involved where they don't have time to spend with their family. My wife is a preacher's kid. My mother is a preacher's kid. So I'm around them. Why is it that men sometimes fail in that capacity? My wife and my mother, perfect preacher's kids. Let me just make sure I get that right away. But why is it that sometimes people fail? I've seen it before where there was my grandparents' church growing up. There was a man who was chosen to be an elder. He was a lawyer, he was a very successful lawyer. And he had one son, Jonathan. And Jonathan wasn't the best behaved, especially in Bible class. He was my age. And there was one time in a Bible class, Jonathan was disturbing the entire class. Like, we couldn't pay attention, and the teacher kicked him out. You're not going to leave. We can't deal with this. That elder came to that Bible class teacher and read him the right act. How dare you kick my son out? I'm an elder of this church. How dare you do that? And the teacher said, well, I'm not teaching you. You can just literally find someone else to teach the rest of the class. You have run this bridge. That man, for whatever reason, was incapable of restraining his son. Unfortunately, his son got addicted to drugs and died before his 20th birthday. Because he failed to show restraint. For whatever reason, he was serving God. He got so far off track in his personal life that he fell into that trap. We have to be sensitive to that our leaders are capable of struggling in their lives, and we need to make sure that we're bolstering them up. Again, these 2 men failed at home, and these are learned behaviors by the children. When a child back talks at 4, it can be cute, even though it's not fun. They have a bad attitude. Eden, my girl, she can have a really sassy bad attitude, and it's kind of fun. But when she's 16, it won't be funny, And I know it's funny. Just sure that I teach him the right behaviors and don't cause him to have learned behaviors that cause a problem in his life. So maybe what caused this is kind of what we're looking at. Well, a couple things. Remember that obtaining spiritual excellence involves our leaders. And it involves us. Let's, as we close class today, look at a couple examples, a couple of specific applications that we can take away from Isaiah on how to gain spiritual excellence and apply it in our life. We need our leaders to be self-aware. As we talked about, your nose is here, your mouth is here. If you have bad breath, you won't know about it. You lack self-awareness. We need our leaders to understand that they need to be self-aware. We need to be self-aware. But especially our leaders. Samuel was completely gobsmacked that, why are you turning away? I don't understand this. And he couldn't even see that his own family had caused this problem. Eli's own family had caused a problem. He was not understanding them. 1 Timothy chapter 4, verse 16 says, keep a close watch on yourself and on the teaching. Persist in this, for by doing so you will save both yourself and your hearers. Paul is talking to Timothy directly. You keep an eye on yourself, Timothy. Before, he had said, don't let people despise you. Meaning, don't let them ignore you. Don't let people ignore you just because you're young, but also keep a watch on yourself. Take that log out of your eye. Make sure you can see clearly before you try to go to your brother and take that speck of dust out of theirs. Keep a watch on yourself and on what you're teaching, what you're doing and what you're saying, and persist in this. For by doing so, you save yourself and the hearers too. We need leaders who are self-aware. And I just want to say, I think our leaders are. I think our leaders are self-aware. I think the generational legacy that we've had in this congregation has to be self-aware. You go out here in this part of the auditorium, back to my right and your left, and there's a plaque of the names of all the men who have served the Lord in the capacity of an eldership at this congregation. And it's a wonderful list to see. And I wish more congregations did that. We can go back and we can look at the men that served, and in the times that they served, they were men of God. And we can be grateful for that they kept a close watch on themselves and on the teaching. And I think one thing that it means is that if we know that we're straying, we correct it, and then maybe we get out of that job. We relieve ourselves of that job of leader, because if I'm losing track here and if I'm going astray, I don't want to be a part of that. Something Phyllis said one time as we were talking about Titus. We were talking about the qualifications of elders, and she said, there's a lot of things to talk about what an elder should be to get him in the job, but nothing about how you get him out of the job. That's a good point. The men that go in the job need to be aware that when they get too close to people to get out, they need to get out. And I think that's something that we need to make sure our leaders are. I think they are, but us too. As we go in our lives, maybe we find ourselves in a leadership position. We watch ourselves and what we do and what we teach. And we persist in that. We don't just do it once and go once a year. Yeah, you're pretty good. Routinely, over and over again, we're checking ourselves. And then we need to let them spend time with family. Deuteronomy 6, starting in verse 6. Moses says, and these words which I command you today shall be on your heart. And you shall teach them diligently to your children, and shall talk to them of this when you sit in your house, and when you walk by the way, and when you lay down, and when you rise up. You shall bind them as a sign of your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. You shall write them on the doorposts of your house and on your gates. Moses says, if you want to teach children, you talk about it all the time. And when you go do a work for God, you take them with you. Where are they walking? I don't know where they're walking, but maybe they're walking to serve God. When you get up in the morning, when you go by at night, when you walk around, when you ride, whatever you do, you apply that to God. Put it in their hearts when they're early. We need to make sure not only that our leaders are self-aware, but they have time for family. We can be very needy. Just as a people in general. I'm not saying us as a congregation, but just people in general can be needy. And typically all of the elders here, at least in my mind, is the dirty laundry, the bad stuff. When was the last time you went up to an elder and said, well, thanks for everything you do? Thanks for being an elder. What a terrible job you do sometimes. It's just the pain and suffering that you have to see. Thank you for all that you do. When's the last time maybe that you thought about maybe going to the elders and asking, when's the last time you spent time with your family? Is there anything I can do to help you see your children, or do more with your kids, or to spend time with your family? I know I haven't. I know I suffer in that way. But it's important that they're self-aware, but then they also spend time with their by Satan that Eli and Samuel felt, where their families suffer because of the service that they're rendering to God. We shouldn't allow that to happen as a people. We need to support our leaders in that way. And then what about us? What do we need? Well, we need to walk with God. From our spiritual leaders, we need them to be self-aware. We need them to spend time with family, but we need to walk with God. We need to answer that call because they have. Right? If they're our spiritual leaders and we have asked them to be above us and we've submitted ourselves to their leadership, then they have answered that call. So we need to get lock and step with them, and we need to walk with God. Answer the call that He's given to us. And then we also need to be engaged in the work. Isaiah. I love this passage, starting in chapter 6. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lit high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. And above it stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. 2 he covered his face, and 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one cried to another, said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the posts of the door were shaken by the voice of him who cried out, and the house was filled with smoke. So I said, Woe is me, for I am undone, because I'm a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips. For my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Then one of the seraphim flew to me, having in his hand a live coal, in which he had taken the tongs from the altar. And he touched my mouth with it, and said, Behold, this has touched your lips, your iniquity is taken away, and your sin is purged. I also heard the voice of the Lord saying, Whom shall I send, and who will go for us? Then I said, Here am I, send me. We need to get engaged in the work of God. We have a very dramatic scene that's played out for us here in Isaiah. Isaiah is sitting in the throne room of God, and he finds himself inadequate of what's going on. The seraphim calling out so much that it's shaking the room. And he's just completely overwhelmed, and then he's purified, and then God asks for a helper. And he can't but get engaged. I think about sometimes in my house, when I need the kids to do something, or I'm getting ready to make a pie or something, and I want the kids to be involved. Sometimes if I ask, would you like to come? No. So what I've done lately is I go, boy, I sure need a helper. Boy, I wish I had someone to help you. I'll do it. And I just chuckle when I read this passage, because I'm not saying God put it like that, but I almost think about it that way, that there's this huge scene that God has allowed Isaiah to say, and he's just like, Lord, we need a helper. Who's going to go for us? Who can we send? I will. I'll go. When was the last time we got that excited to be involved in the work of God? That we declared, here I am. Not, here's Steve, here's Ron. They would be a good fit for that. I'm here. And you notice he said, yeah, drag that out of the house and put that down and all that. No, send me. I think about sometimes the question, when was the last time we asked to be sent by God? When was the last time we prayed, God, make me a nomad for you. Put me where you need me to be, for however long it needs to be. Send me to that work, and I'll go. Take me out of the land of my fathers, like you did Abraham. Give me a tent to live in. I don't care. That's a hard one. It's a hard one when we put roots down, when we have families, and we have other things going on in our lives. But Isaiah was willing to be sent for his work. Sometimes when we need to reach spiritual excellence, it's not in the life and the location of where we're living at that moment. We might need to be sent somewhere. We might need to go, and we might need to do for God elsewhere than where He's put us at that time. And I'd like to encourage us to think about this passage. And I'm not saying we all need to do that. Sometimes God puts us in a place and we stay all our lives. I've lived in a few different places, and I don't know if I'll stay in Columbus forever. I don't know. I don't know what God has planned for us. But I try as a habit to make it that God would put me where He would want me, and that He would send me where He would need me to go. So I would just encourage us, as we seek the work of God, as we seek our leaders to be self-aware, as we seek to have them spend family time together, as we seek to engage in a walk with God, that we realize that we might need to be sent. And it might not be Columbus, Ohio that He has for us for all of our lives. And even if we get All things considered, God calls us to spiritual excellence. And I hope we've seen that today, that where the eagles fly, where the okapi, where the deer might walk, God calls us to those places. It is contingent upon our leader. That we see that the Israelites were driven down a bad path because their leadership was terrible. We don't have that excuse. We've got great leaders here. It is contingent on our leaders providing us an opportunity to excel and showing us the way, showing us the path. How to get there. Now that we've changed, what do? We don't need to be alone. We've got leaders to show us the way. But it's also contingent upon us that we are engaged and that we're sent. And that we're not sitting down waiting for the work to come to us, that we're excited to be God's helper. And if he needs big helpers, we'll be there for him. And we'll go and do what he asks us. Clay will be back talking about reasoning together, starting in the book of Isaiah. Hope you all have a wonderful week.